Okay, welcome everybody. I think we are ready to start. My name is Alex Kulkin. I'm Senior Digital Forensic Analyst at Group IB. And today we are going to talk a bit about Prolog ransomware and how a quite popular Trojan called Quackbot was used for initial access in these big game hunters operations. Okay, so a few rules. Your microphone will be turned off. Of course, everybody who, for some reason, can join us today will get a recording of this webinar. This webinar will last about 45 minutes. And of course, I'll be very happy to answer all of your questions on the corresponding slide. If you still haven't checked, we have just released a white paper on the same topic called Lock Like a Pro: How Quackbot Fills Enterprise Ransomware Campaigns. So you can use this QR code to download the white paper if you prefer reading over listening. So let's start from some definitions of what big game hunting is. So big game hunters are attackers who are focused on really big companies with outstanding revenues. So why do they do so? Because such companies can pay very big ransom. So we participate during our incident response engagements and our threat intelligence engagements in around 150 different attacks, which we call big game hunting, and the average ransom demand over last 6 months was $1.8 million. So as you can see, the demand is quite big. Of course, in some cases, the ransom may be not that big. It may be just a few hundred of thousands, but more and more threat actors tend to attack really big companies, and the ransom demands can be calculated in millions. So let's go back to Prolog ransomware. So this piece of ransomware is the successor of PoundLocker, which began operating in late 2019. But unfortunately, this piece of ransomware had a bug, and encrypted files could be decrypted without getting the key from the attackers. So the group rebranded, fixed that bug and rebranded their ransomware and released Prolog. So one of the biggest attack of this group was in April. They successfully attacked Diebold Nixdorf. That's one of the major ATM providers. The first post was released in Group IB blog in May, which covered some of the techniques used by this threat actor. If you want to check this blog post, you can use QR code on this slide as well. So as already been said, typically these big game hunting campaigns start from Qbot malspam. Nowadays, this Trojan is very active. Recently, it even got to top 10 of malicious program distributed via phishing emails. It happened the first time in its history. What's more, in some cases, it's dropped by another quite popular Trojan called Emotet. that is also known to be used in big game hunting operations, but by other group that distributes TrickBot Trojan. So the emails are quite simple and straightforward, but very interesting thing about this email that these are replies to legitimate emails that are exfiltrated from different compromised companies. So even if it really looks like a phishing email, quite often people still download the attachment and run it, even if it's kind of weird. For example, in this email, it was a VBS script. And talking about VB scripts that were used, they were quite big. They were about 40 megabytes in size. So it allowed the threat actor to bypass security controls, because many antiviruses and other types of security controls, they skip such large files. So this allowed QBot operators to successfully infect the initial host. Of course, this wasn't the only type of attachment that we used. Of course, good old mail docs were used as well. So as you can see on this slide, this is a screenshot of an XLS file that was used to distribute QuackBot quite recently. Just like many other Trojans like TrickBot, Emotet, Ursnif, and others, these phishing attachments contains instructions for the user, so it can enable content and enable editing, and it allows the malicious document to run the code that will download the QBot. Quite popular and quite typical technique, but still it allows the group to compromise many companies. So as you can see here, it's an infection example. As already been said, it's an XLS file. So you can see on the screenshot, it's a screenshot from our own sandbox. Of course, you can use some public sandboxes as well, like Enrun, etc. But it's much better to have your own private sandbox for doing so. So the kill chain is quite common. So if we are talking about some hunts that can be used, as you can see that xl.exe starts another executable in not so common location. At the same time, they can see that a scheduled task is created for persistence. That is also quite common technique, and of course it's very important to monitor such behaviors. They are typical, but many threat actors, from commodity malware like Emotet, QBot, and others, to some advanced threat actors, for example, like Red Curl, which we discovered quite recently, they still use very common techniques for persistence. For example, run keys, startup folders, scheduled tasks, etc. So how can we hunt for QuackBot infections if for some reason your security controls skip it? So first of all, in some campaigns, Excel or Microsoft Word application will drop VBS files. So Here you can see how group IB's hunt point detects such behavior. Quite typical locations for files used by QBot are the root of user profile folder, program data folder. So here you can see that program data is used and that a VBS file is dropped to that folder. So again, you can search for process creation events, and you can search for command lines that contains both program data and VBS. And here you can see that our hunt detected a few different infections of QBot. Another example, as PowerShell still used quite often, and QBot is not an exception. So here we can see that it's used to download initial load from different compromised websites. So these payloads are deleted and blocked quite often, but nevertheless, one of the links can be still active. That's why typically the loader contains a few of them. Again, as we know that in most cases, initial QBot load is saved to random folder on compromised website with a PNG extension, and it's downloaded via PowerShell. We can hunt for command lines that contain both PowerShell and PNG in the same line. And one more example. Unlike some other Trojans like TrickBot, for example, or Emotet, QBot payload is stored under not under roaming, but under roaming Microsoft folder. So again, you can hunt for command lines which contain appdata, roaming Microsoft, and .exe keywords. So again, here you can see that the process creation of such executables, that is QBot payload, is detected as well. Again, talking about persistence, quite common persistence mechanisms are used: run keys and startup folder, and scheduled tasks. Again, make sure that you can easily detect such behaviors, or at least you can search for newly created parameters in run keys, newly created LNK files or executables in startup folders, or newly created or deleted scheduled tasks. As already been said, typically QBot is located under user profile, appdata, roaming, Microsoft, random letters folder, and random letter executable. So again, it's quite common, and as you've seen on the previous slide, you can hunt for it quite easily as well. Talking about post-exploitation, during our incident response engagements, we've seen at least a few times that the threat actors used CVE 2019-0859 to escalate their privileges. So it's a vulnerability in Windows, then Win32k component fails to properly handle objects in memory. They used a separate executable file for privilege escalation. So again, it's a good idea to search for suspicious executable in program data folder, in the root of user profile, and in user's public folder as well. So these three folders are used quite often by this threat actor. As for discovery, two different tools were used. The first one was SharpHound, which is a part of Bloodhound. They used generic output to store the results of SharpHound. So again, it may be a good idea to search for bloodhound.zip enterprise-wide, and maybe you'll be lucky enough to detect it. And just before Prolog deployment, another tool was used, which is AdFind, another very popular tool that's used by many threat actors that are involved in big game hunting. And another important point that the time between running Bloodhound to running AdFind and deploying Prolog is typically 2 weeks. So if you're doing threat hunting activities based on some common techniques that's used by these threat actors, and by the way, by many other ransomware operators that are involved in big game hunting, you may be very lucky to detect such malicious activities in time and prevent ransomware deployment in the end. Lateral movement, of course, is RDP. I think it's the most popular protocol that is used by, I think, almost any threat actor that is operating nowadays. To enable RDP on remote host, if it's disabled, Prolog operators used pre-built batch scripts and deployed them via PSExec. PSExec was used not only for this. The same legitimate tool was used to deploy Cobalt Strike beacon loaders on different hosts in the form of PowerShell one-liners. Again, quite common technique. And also threat actors deployed Quackbot loader enterprise-wide via PSExec. This fact may point that QBot operators and Prolog operators may be the same group or two tightly connected groups. So what about the ransomware itself? Typically, it's contained of two parts: a batch script and a masqueraded file with the payload. We've seen 3 different file types. We've seen a PNG file, we've seen a CSV file, and we've seen a JPG file. But also, in some cases, it may be distributed as a standalone executable. It's downloaded manually by threat actors using a bits job, and it's executed manually as well. But it's executed manually typically on domain controllers or on some backup servers after the backups are removed or wiped by the threat actor. Prolog, it's just like any other piece of ransomware. Prolog removes volume shadow copies, stops quite a lot of different services and processes after initial execution, so it can encrypt every file that's available. For encryption, it uses RC6, and the encryption key is encrypted with RSA 1024. It can be executed manually, as already been said, and of course it can be deployed via Quackbot. Again, typically it's deployed to program data folder. And in some cases, we've seen that WMIC was used to distribute it and to run it on some of hosts in compromised infrastructure. So regarding ransom demands, in one of the recent samples we uncovered, we've seen that the ransom demand was 255 BTC. This is quite a big amount. It's about 2.7 millions of dollars. Again, during some negotiations, this amount can be reduced, but anyway, as many big game hunters, many ransomware operators that targets huge companies, they look at each other and they see that some groups demand, for example, $10 million, and they receive the ransom for decryption, and that's why these ransom amounts become larger and larger every time. So, for example, this group who is working with Prolog ransomware, they started from about 35 BTC, and nowadays you can see that they want a few millions for decryption. So again, here you can see the QR code for our white paper downloading. So if you still haven't downloaded it, it's a good chance. And at the same time, if you have any questions regarding TUBot or regarding Prolog operations, you can ask them right now, and I'll do my best to answer all of them. Okay, so we have a few questions. So, and the first one is, what sets it apart from other ransomwares? So, first of all, this ransomware is deployed at least at some point of time. Prolog operators use banking Trojan. It's not very new. For example, as I already mentioned, another piece of ransomware, for example, Rook and Conti, they use TrickBot. That is another banking Trojan. So they used banking Trojans to compromise initial host and to move laterally if it's possible, and then they get all they need, for example, domain administrator account, etc. They are deploying the piece of ransomware. So they have a more advanced technique, because if we are talking about many others, for example, NetWalker and other big game hunters, they typically focus on vulnerability and different VPN appliances. They use RDP for initial access. Prolog operators also used RDP in the beginning, but nowadays they are focused on compromise using QBot banking Trojan. So next question is about the techniques which are quite common. And of course, even built-in antivirus software may detect this technique. But again, it's not always enabled on every host. And of course, in big enterprise networks, you can find different hosts with different operating system. For example, you can find Windows 7, which is very common for big networks. So if the attackers were able to compromise the initial host, at least one of the hosts, and if they can elevate privileges or dump credentials, for example, some companies used administrator account that is valid for every host in the network because system administrators find it quite useful. And if it's so, they can deploy a wide variety of batch script. For example, in these cases, with Prolog, they just used batch scripts to disable antivirus software, including Windows Defender. So that's why it's possible to overcome this software. Again, for example, it's also quite common then initial phishing attachments, it's opened, the piece of malware is downloaded. The piece of malware is downloaded, then the attachment is detected immediately, then the initial load is detected as well, but the payload itself is downloaded and dropped to, for example, Microsoft app data ROM in Microsoft folder. It's not detected, and it allows attackers to do some follow-up activities. Okay, next question: how we can protect our companies in advance? What measures can be applied? This is quite common question, and again, it depends on your infrastructure. If you have updated software, if you have security controls deployed everywhere, if you have good cyber threat intelligence, if you have good detection capabilities, if you have team that can do both proper intelligence consumption and threat hunting, and can properly work with all security controls, the chances that you can be successfully attacked by this group or by any other group that's involved in big game hunting, they are quite low. But again, unfortunately, in many cases, it's quite difficult because networks may be very big, and information security officers can't control everything. That's why many threat actors still capable of gaining access at least to some hosts. And the best way to protect from such attacks is, of course, do some proactive activities like threat hunting, because these attacks they last typically a few weeks. So it's not, in many cases, it's not like they got initial access to network and deploy ransomware immediately. Of course, in some cases, this works also, but it's quite rare because they need to remove backups, they need to prepare everything for proper deployment. So that's why they need quite a lot of time to finish the attack. And if you hunt for such malicious actions, you can detect the threat actor is in your network at early stage and prevent them from successful ransomware deployment. Okay, another question was the recent QBot campaign partner 01 detected deploying Prolog. During our recent incident response engagements, we haven't seen it, but I think it was used, especially when this campaign was associated with Emotet Trojans that was already mentioned. So Emotet previously was used in Emotet Trickbot Rook or Emotet Trickbot Conti chain. So most likely in these cases it will be similar chain, but this time Emotet, Quackbot, and Prolog. Okay, thank you guys for coming to listen about these big game hunting campaigns. Sorry, we have one more question. Oh. Or not. Okay. Thanks a lot. Again, if you still haven't done it, you can use QR code on this slide to download the report. And of course, the recording of this, if you or your colleagues registered for this webcast, you will receive the recording via email in a few days. Okay, thank you.